The last unit we'll be discussing training adaptations and environmental considerations. So the first part of this unit, I will be discussing all the different systems that we've talked about to this point and the adaptations that go about from within each of those systems. Okay, we'll talk about a few concepts within periodization. We'll talk about a few concepts within training. That is, the overload principle. We'll talk about specificity training, principle of individuality, also known as, heredity. And then talk about what those are, getting the training adaptations, and then we'll go forward with, all the systems and what happens via training, what systems improve. And just know that this last unit is basically accumulation of all the three units we've talked about. So it's not going to be cumulative for the final, but if I'm talking about certain concepts within here, you need to know what they are, because I'm bringing in neuromuscular, metabolic, and cardiovascular concepts into then a training adaptation, a training type situation. So the real world application based situation. So make sure you know all the concepts that we've talked about and everything leading up to that. Okay. And so, like I said, that's what the first part of this is. And then the next parts of the chapter we'll get into environmental considerations, and I'll discuss those when we get to that point. Moving on to the last unit within the semester here, we'll be starting off first with talking about training adaptations. And from there, we will move on to environmental considerations. Okay, so this first part with training adaptations, basically going to take all three units we've talked about to this point. So neuromuscular, metabolism, cardiovascular, and then put it all into basically an application type situation, or just looking at it in the real world, talking about what really is taking place with training, what systems are improving, which ones are not. Okay, so this last unit is not going to be tested cumulatively over the first three units, but you need to make sure that you have paid attention, you've studied, and you know the material from the first three, because this last unit, we're going to be bringing up a lot of the concepts we've already talked about. Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about in this unit, then you need to go back and study to make sure you know. Okay, so one of the first things with training is, one of the major principles is the overload principle. Okay, and the overload principle states that a system does not improve until it is forced to perform above and beyond the normal, usual daily demands. Okay, and this is really one of the first ideas of training, is that if you're going to make improvements, you have to push the body or push the system on and beyond what is normally capable to start making improvements. Okay, the overall principle is saying that if you want to improve, you have to train harder. You have to train longer. You have to train, much more days or much more sessions through the week, which you see at the bottom is accompanied by increasing intensity, frequency, or duration, either alone or in combination. Okay, and I always say this: if you've always done what you've always, or if you keep doing what you've always done, you're going to keep getting what you've always gotten. Okay, that is, if you don't keep making adjustments to your training, you keep adding either intensity, that is, every time you lift, you put a little bit more weight on, or every time you run, you go a little bit further, or a little bit faster, or another session throughout the week for training, then you're never going to make improvements. Okay, you really need to stress the systems in order to make those improvements, as pushing the body on and beyond what is normally capable that it's able to do. And so because of that statement, that's why the overall principle is so important. And it's just one of the basic concepts of strength and conditioning. That is, you need to keep pushing the body past a certain point. Now, the key is, though, is not this, it says the overload. So you're just overloading the system. I guess, just putting a little bit more, you're putting more stress on the body over time. The key is not to push the body on and beyond to a point to where you actually injure or damage the system. Okay, you don't want to push it to the point to where you actually overtrain. We'll talk about that coming up. And so this is why it gets into strength and conditioning, and it really is an art form, knowing how fast and how hard to push your athletes, but not doing it to a point to where you actually cause damage on and beyond like muscle, soreness. We're talking like actual true, protein damage to where like rhabdomyolysis, which is a breakdown of protein into the blood. Okay, we're talking like severe clinical situations where you've damaged the body, not just sore muscles, that sort. Okay, so when you're looking at overload, like I said, you go to intensity, frequency, or duration. All of them are important, but really, if you want to look at what really helps out, intensity would be one that slightly is favored over the other two. Okay, intensity really does drive the stimulus because I could train, 5 days a week for, an hour each day. But if all I did was, move one step per minute kind of deal, like just take one step every minute, I do that for an hour every day, that's not really going to cause a big stimulus upon the body. Okay. And so that's why, I always say like intensity is super, super important. But then again, you really can't have the other two with as well. So if I were to, kind of list them out in order of importance, I'd put like intensity be like 1A, frequency and duration would be 2B and 2C, and those two in no particular order. Okay. So I would say intensity, they're both important. They're both, at the top, but intensity is slightly favored just a little bit. And it's the same thing too. I could train at super high intensity, but if I only do it for 2 minutes, if I do it every day, once again, the duration is not that long. So is it really that big of a stimulus? And so when you're looking at how to design a program, how to train athletes, you need to know how to incorporate all three of these factors to get the most out of your athletes. So this should come of no surprise here, but the more you train throughout the week, the better response you're going to get. And this is just looking at VO2 max, but really you could put any variable in there. And this does say exercise frequency as in days per week, but really frequency should be thought of as sessions per week. Okay, because you might go, I want an athlete to train at a frequency of 10 per week. Well, there's only 7 days in a week. How did you get a few extra days? Well, it's because you're doing like 2 days. Okay, so frequency should be thought of as sessions. And you can see right here, more or less, the more sessions throughout the week, the better response you're going to get. Like I said, any variable could be inputted in here, strength, whatever. Here's duration. The longer you go, the better response you're going to get. Okay, you can see up here, duration in terms of minutes. That's usually pretty common there. We should always look at duration as minutes. You can look at just the more minutes you train in terms of VO2 max. Well, what duration is looking at too, though, and what duration is kind of getting at as well is you can kind of think of time under tension. That is more work done in a session. And that kind of goes into intensity as well. Both those kind of looking at the same thing, kind of separate up just how long or how hard you're working, but also you got to think of what is the actual amount of work being done. Okay, and so if I'm doing more work in a exercise session, that's going to bring about better adaptations, better changes. Okay, and same thing with intensity. But really, when you're looking at these, just looking at like that time under tension. Okay, if I'm lifting, but I'm only doing 1 minute of actual lifting throughout, you want to be able to have a greater amount of time that the system that you're trying to improve is it has that tension placed on it. So, but nonetheless, you can see how all three of these factors have an impact upon any variable. This is just looking at VO2 max, but you can input any variable there and saying the longer, the harder, more sessions throughout the week, the better response you'll get. Okay, the next is looking at principles of training in terms of specificity of training. That is, the only system that improves is a system which is overloaded. When you're looking at how to train an athlete, you need to focus on what is the needs analysis of that athlete. What's the specifics of the sport they're trying to compete in? And once you get that, then you need to tailor a program to fit the needs of that athlete. Okay, if I'm a cyclist, then most of my training should be done via cycling. If I'm in a crew, so a rower, well, I need to find workouts that incorporate rowing, upper and lower body. Football player, this is always the classic one, at least in the older days, is before the season starts, coaches always make their athletes go out and run a couple miles to get in shape for football. Well, football is an extreme anaerobic sport. So why would you need any kind of aerobic, training to hit at that? You don't. Okay, so training's got a lot more specific for football over the years, but in the old days, we go out and run a couple miles just to get in shape for football. So when you're looking at specificity of training, you need to find ways to train that's going to improve the system that that really is being used in your competition, and then you hit that system to overload it to make the specific improvements. Okay, in terms of the weight room, what should you be doing? Well, once again, the strength coach should know the needs of the athlete and know how to train with that. I'm a big believer in Olympic lifting, as most know. So I really think that Olympic lifts do transfer over to pretty much any sport that you want to participate in. Okay, because all sports, for the most part, have, you need strength, you need explosive strength, you need power, you need acceleration, deceleration, flexibility. So Olympic lifts do train a lot of that. But nonetheless, when it comes to designing a program, make sure you tailor it to the sport that the athlete's trying to compete in. And you see at the bottom, it says multidimensional activities require variety in the training programs. Okay, this is what I keep saying. Strength coaching is an art form. A coach needs to understand all needs of an athlete, because a lot of times most athletes have multiple systems that need to be trained. And so it's up to them to come up with a program that's going to be able to overload all those systems in order to bring about the greatest amount of performance. Here's a VO2 of 3 different types of endurance athletes. You see cyclists, rowers, and runners, and it should come of no surprise. So all 3 of these athletes performed basically 3 VO2 max tests. They all did a running VO2 max, a cycling VO2 max, and then an arm VO2 max. An arm VO2 max would be done on it's an arm crank, so it looks like a bicycle for the upper extremities, for the arms. Okay, you don't see those as much nowadays. They used to be bigger back, I think, 80s, 90s in most gyms, but now, I guess with the advent of elliptical machines, most people get their upper body workout that way. But most research labs still have an arm ergometer, and so you see all 3 of these athletes right here perform 3 VO2 max. Well, it should come as no surprise that those who cycle had the highest VO2 max when they did a cycling VO2 max. Same thing with the runners. Runners had the highest when running, and the rowers, you can see, had a higher running and arm VO2 max than cycling. Well, this just goes to show you that if you're looking to test someone or you're looking to see where the greatest performance comes about, it's going to come from those who tailor their program with the ideas, with the goal of competing in that type of sport. That is, if you're a cyclist, they're going to perform the best when they cycle. Runners when they run. Rowers when they do an upper and lower body. So all this is just showing you is that when you tailor a training program to fit the needs of the athletes, then they're going to have the best improvements in that system then. You see percent change of VO2 max, and then percent change in the immediate system, the ATP PCR system. Well, those who did endurance training had a much greater improvement in VO2 max than those who just did sprint training. Well, those who did aerobic training had a huge improvement in their aerobic systems. Well, that's that's not a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer right there. And of course, those who did nothing but sprint training had a greater improvement in their anaerobic systems than those who just did endurance training. Well, all this is just showing you that you're going to get better at that specific training if that's all you do. Okay? This should be a no-brainer that if you do nothing but anaerobic training, you have an improvement in your anaerobic systems and vice versa. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the graph on the left, percent change of VO2 max, those who did sprint training still had an improvement in their aerobic systems. And so what we're finding out more and more is that anaerobic training, because of the intensity, does have a transfer, does have an impact upon aerobic systems more than we originally thought. Okay, and this is where you get into Tabata. If you ever seen studies that they did back in the 90s, pretty much every high-intensity interval training study or fitness program is based off Tabata, which did 8 rounds of 10 seconds rest, 20 seconds work. And so what they found there is that you did see improvements in VO2 max despite the high intensity but short duration training. Okay, so this is just showing you that there is an improvement you're going to get from anaerobic training and the aerobic system. Now, if your goal is to become the best runner, to have the highest VO2 max, then you need to stick to doing just strictly endurance training. Okay, but if you're looking to get improvements in health, that's why we're seeing that anaerobic training has improvements on health, is because we see, through this high intensity training, we get improvements in a lot of our cardiovascular and metabolic factors. Next is heredity. So the success of a training program is limited by genetic endowment. That is your body type, gender, your initial system levels, adaptation capacity, adaptation rate, etc. And so I always say, if you want to be an elite world-class athlete, then you need to pick the right parents. That's the only way that you're going to be able to have that kind of genetics, is by picking, the right parents. Unfortunately, most of us can't. So how do we then try and try and get to the point where we are the best we possibly could be? Well, this is through a proper strength and conditioning program. Okay, there are all these freak athletes like Michael Phelps, like Usain Bolt, or Pocket Hercules. They're just born with just best genetics. I mean, if you look at Michael Phelps, he's just built to be a swimmer. He's got a little shorter legs, even though he's 6'5", but for his body, he's got short legs and a really long torso and really long arms, okay, and a really wide back. That means just perfect, perfectly built for swimming. Usain Bolt is a freak because most sprinters are right around 6 foot tall. Usain Bolt is 6'4"-ish, thereabouts. I'm not sure exactly how tall, 6'4" to 6'5". And so what happens, like, when you get taller, for sprinting at least, is, well, one good thing about being tall is you have a longer stride length. However, the taller you become, the slower your turnover rate, that is, cycling rate of your legs, gets slower. And so that's why most sprinters, about 6 foot, 6'1", they have a good stride length there, but then they're able to turn their legs over really fast. Well, Usain Bolt's a freak because he has that stride length, but then he has a really fast turnover for his legs. And they say that his turnover rate is equivalent to someone who's like 6 foot tall. So, you have someone with the long stride length with that really fast turnover rate, makes him, at the time, one of the fastest men ever. Okay, they're just, genetics does play a huge part. But since most of us can't pick our parents and we don't have these phenomenal genetics, you can still be a world-class athlete. It takes, a lot of training and a lot of dedication. Okay, and then you try and do the best you can with that. Okay, periodization. This is the basis of everything we've talked to at this point. When you're looking at strength and conditioning, you're looking at training athletes, you need to incorporate a program that's going to allow them to peak at a certain point in time. Okay, so periodization is basically you're planning out the program for the athlete through their training cycle for a certain competition. So this is the technical definition you read over. But basically all this is saying right here is, like I said, it's a theoretical and practical construct that allows for the systematic, sequential, and integrative programming of training interventions into mutually dependent periods of time in order to induce specific physiological adaptations that underpin performance outcomes. What that's saying is that periodization is a planned out program to make the greatest amount of hit the greatest stimulus and to allow for the greatest adaptations to an athlete, to allow them to peak with their performance at a certain point in time. That point in time is always going to be surrounding major competitions. Okay, so For the Olympics, that would be that one. For, college football, it would be, the big games during the season, but then also the playoffs, or I should say the conference championship, playoffs, and then national championship. That's ideally where you want your athletes peaking the most, will be at that national championship. Okay, and so that's what periodization is. As opposed to general fitness, what most people do is they don't write down what they've lifting, they'll write down their program. But periodization, you're actually writing out the entire program for the entire year leading up, or the entire 4 years leading up to the major competitions. And they break them up. You got macro, meso, and microcycles. Macro is typically an entire training year, but also maybe a period of months up to 4 years, like for the Olympics. And then macro cycles made up of a bunch of mesocycles. So these are 2 or more cycles within the macro, each lasting several weeks or several months, just depending on how long the program is and when your competitions are. And then microcycles are anywhere from several days to a couple of weeks. So there's it's just, this is where you block up and break apart the training cycle throughout the entire training period. And this is where you're getting to the point where you're trying to get the athletes to peak at a certain point in time. When it comes to the training cycles, you're going to have a couple of phases, or a number of phases. So you can see preparation phase, first transition, competition, and second transition. So your preparation phase is where you're getting, preparation phase, basically the off season. Okay, and so the off season, that's where you're trying to make the biggest gains, trying to make the most, progress, trying to get bigger, faster, stronger for the season. Then you transition to the first transition, which gets into kind of like the preseason. Okay, so preparation would be off season, first transition would be preseason, where you're fine tuning everything, getting ready for the season, which would be a competition phase. And then the second transition would be the postseason, where you're trying to do active recovery, trying to get body healthy, injuries, rehab, all that, getting back to then another training cycle, which would be the preparation phase again. But you can see right here, the main variables, you got volume and intensity. You can see that volume's high, intensity is low in the off season or the preparation phase. As time goes on, you start seeing them start to switch right around competition phase. That's because you can't have the two at the same. You can't have high volume and high intensity, because there's where you're going to basically overtrain the system. And so that's why you have the high volume, low intensity, and then you start to switch when you get closer and closer to competition. Your volume, and so volume is basically number of sets, number of reps is probably the easiest way to kind of look at volume. A couple of different ways to equate volume out. You could do reps by sets by weight, and a lot of times I think doing just purely reps is not a bad way to go. But anyways, you can't have like I said, high volume and high intensity. So you start to switch, and you start switching to where you start lowering the amount of reps you're doing, or you could say number of sets you're doing in a workout, lowering the number of days you're training, because volume's also, number of reps, which encompasses frequency and kind of duration as well. Okay, and so you're lowering the number of training days throughout the week, training sessions, I should say, the number of sets, but then intensity is going up higher and higher and higher, closer to the maximum. Because there's where you're trying to maintain that fitness built up by the intensity, because you're lowering down the volume. And there's where you start to switch when you get close to competition. And so those will start to switch, and then you allow for intensity to dictate, and you can see trying to peak right around, you see at the end of the competition phase, because that's right around where the championships are basically starting to take place. Then the green is the technique. And so when you're looking at technique, think of that as, you could think of it as like sport practice. So for football, technique would be looking at how much time you're actually practicing the sport. How many times you're out there running plays and really spending 2-3 hours practice. Well, in the off season, it's very low. Okay, and then it starts to climb closer and closer and closer you get to competition. Well, that's another reason why you lower the volume, is because when you get into the competition phase, at that point, where the two is switched, well, athletes are spending, 2 to 3 hours every day in practice. Okay, then they're trying to get a workout in. That's a lot of stress on the body. Okay, and at that point, you've done as much as you possibly can. They start to switch that you want to maintain what's been built up via the high intensity, but then allowing also the training because you're having training going on while you're doing the practicing as well. And so that's what the green line is saying is that closer competition, you're practicing more. So there's your stimulus is going to be from the intensity and from the practice itself. And then ideally you want to be peaking, at the end of the competition phase, which means that's hopefully the championship. And this is why I keep saying strength coaching is an art form. Each one of those, it says daily, micro, and mesocycle fluctuations, and you see all of them right there. Well, what that's getting at is you're going to have days where athletes just won't train the way you want them to. Okay, we forget that athletes have lives. And not everyone wants to be just practicing nonstop. And even when they are running practice, you think, as a professor, sometimes, be honest, I forget this, and coaches forget this, that when you're working with young people, they have a lot of things going on, and sometimes your class or sometimes training. They might have relationship issues. Their boyfriend or girlfriend might be, having trouble with them, might be having family issues. Okay, they might be having some other personal matters that you don't know about. And so if you're seeing, and that's why it's important as a strength coach, that you're really on the front lines with your athletes. You're kind of knowing where they're at. You're talking with them. You're getting a feel for them. That when they come and talk to you with a problem, you kind of know like, oh, so-and-so came and talked to me about this. We're supposed to train heavy today. Well, maybe I'll cut back instead of, working up to 95% of their best in something. I might work up only to 90%. Okay, so this is where the coach needs to understand their athletes and say, all right, we're going to pull back here. Try and get the most out of them for that day. Okay, and that's why you have these daily, because life's not perfect. Okay, you're going to have ups and downs, and so it's up to the coach to be able to know how to adjust and then plan accordingly based upon whatever's coming at them, through the training system. Okay, one central concept. There's a couple different theories on this, but this is the most talked about one. But you got the general adaptation syndrome, GAS. Okay, and this is alarm, resistance, exhaustion. And I'll go over that in the next slide. But it says one of the foundational concepts from which periodization theories have been developed. So with those, this is essentially what's going on. I guess you could think of this as a physiological, biomechanical, any kind of variable you want to look at right here. Okay, when you introduce a new stimulus, you can see the performance level, new stimulus is introduced. The body's going to go through initial phase where it starts to be overcome by that stimulus. And it says alarm phase. It says the initial phase of training, when stimulus is first recognized and performance generally decreases in response to fatigue. So what's happening is the body's being hit with this new stimulus, and then it's having to then readjust. Okay, you're going to go through a point where the body's kind of a negative situation. It's being broken down more than used to. But eventually, and I'll get to number 4 here in a sec, but once the body starts to understand the stimulus, then it starts to make the adaptations. That's when you get in the second phase, which is resistance. It says this is where adaptation occurs and the systems return to baseline, or in most instances, and elevated above baseline. So the goal is to go from, you're at number 1, that first baseline, through initial stimulus phase, then you start to adapt, and your goal is to get to number 3. That is, you build a new baseline that's higher and above the original baseline. And then once you got this new set point, then you kind of do the exact same thing again. And you keep building that baseline up as high, higher and higher and higher, to where you get basically your athlete to their genetic potential is the goal with this concept right here with the GAS. And that 3 is referred to, you see, as supercompensation phase. So a new level of performance capacity that occurs in response to adaptive response in step 2. Problem is, you never want to get to number 4, overtraining. And this is where most coaches, they push their athletes on and beyond a certain point. Because what happens when you start to introduce a new stimulus, if the stimulus is too great and the body, it's been built upon, like, to a certain point where just too much is built up, then you can start to get the overtraining phase. And then you get really suppressed performance at that point. So the goal is to push your athletes to, like I always say, you push your athletes to the cliff, but don't push them over the cliff. Just push them just to that, right to that point. And then instead of pulling them back, and a lot of times actually what coaches do is they pull the athletes back too much, and then they just push them back to the same cliff. The goal is to push your athletes to the cliff, and then at that point, don't push them over, but then build the cliff out further. That way, then you push them to another point. And then from there, you build the cliff out further. You keep doing that. And the problem is a lot of times coaches push them to that cliff. They'll even push them over, and they're at that point, they're at a overtrained, and it's hard to get back to where they once were. Or they'll push them just to the edge, and then they pull them back too far, and then they push them back to the edge again. So you're really never extending out to that new baseline. You're never really pushing your athletes to a new set point. Okay, but this is why strength and conditioning is a profession that, like I say, a lot of ways art form, because you're knowing how to push your athletes to a certain point, but then don't push them too past it, but then know how to kind of keep pushing them further and further and further without getting them to get into that overtraining part. So major considerations in designing a training program. So what systems do I train? Well, performance is composed of several factors. So what system do you train? It's going to be the system that's being used the most in competition. There's a lot of factors that go into performance, and this is what's up to you as a coach to know which ones it is. Okay, so it says what systems do I train? Well, you have either anaerobic or aerobic systems. Which one's the predominant system in your sport? That's the one you should be focused on how to train. Okay, if you're an aerobic athlete, doing the endurance work. Anaerobic, doing the anaerobic work. That's going to go into the performance, but that's only, a lot of times we always think, it says what system do I train? That's all we think about. Like it says anaerobic, aerobic. But we forget there's a lot of systems that go into performance. Okay. Our nutritional, it's not a system, but a nutritional aspect goes into performance. So, water intake, carbohydrate. What are we consuming? Because we know the importance of both water and carbohydrate intake. And you got CNS function. That is, you're looking at arousal or motivation. A good way to think about that is, are you sleeping well? Okay. So how well is are we resting? That's a huge impact upon performance. You got strength and skills, and of course, practicing, and then, what's our genetics? All that's going to impact performance. And of course, the last one, which is hard to account for, is environment. Altitude, heat, humidity, and I guess cold could be on there as well. And so how are those impacting performance? Because that one gets kind of hard, because if you have a competition at altitude, but you live at sea level, you can't really mimic altitude unless you actually are really, really rich and have an altitude chamber to train in your facility, which most people don't have extra $100,000 laying around to build one. So their option is move to altitude. Okay, so in terms what system do you train? Well, you need to make sure that you're actually hitting all aspects of performance. Okay, we always think of just initially anaerobic, aerobic, which yes, that's a part of it, but there's other parts as well. I really do think sleep, diet, and water intake are some of the most overlooked aspects in the performance. And a lot of times I think we spend too much time on, just the weight room aspects, but we don't really look at those other ones. Okay, most Americans don't sleep well, including athletes. Okay, most of us don't drink enough water or eat enough proper, carbohydrates. And what's amazing is you got athletes like I saw at LSU who would eat like crap, but then still go out there and compete at a level that's unbelievable. Imagine if they actually consume proper nutrition, enough water, and then spend all night out partying. Imagine what kind of athletes they could be. So, nonetheless, there's a lot that goes in performance, but I would say those are some of the most important ones. It says most activities require the use of several systems. So, outside the extremes of a marathon or 100-meter sprint, there's a mixture of it all. Okay, it's up to the coach to understand the needs. Should always be some kind of needs analysis of the athlete and the sport. You should be looking at the athlete going, okay, what kind of athlete, trained versus untrained, how old they are, male or female. And then from there, okay, what sport are they playing? Okay, how you train baseball is going to be different from football, from soccer, from gymnastics, so forth. So it's up to the coach to understand the needs of both the sport and the needs of the athlete. And there's how you develop a proper program for them. Some training considerations. So the neuromuscular system. If you want to improve power, generating ability, well, what should you be focusing on? Remember back to power, strength. Force by velocity gives us power. So hypertrophy or hyperplasia, we don't know if hyperplasia takes place. We've been through that, but hypertrophy is something because as you get the bigger, larger muscles, so you get the greater force production. But then through the anaerobic training, if you're hitting the neuromuscular as the focus, then you're getting an increase in fast myosins. So there's your power increase. So if you want to increase neuromuscular system, I would say be training, for hypertrophy, 8 to 12 reps. And then to get the fast myosins, doing power activities, 1 to 3 reps, but with in an explosive manner. So Olympic lifting, plyometrics, so forth. That's going to really increase the neuromuscular system, give you that power generating ability. And you got metabolic systems. So remember metabolism, how fast we can build up ATP versus how fast we're breaking it down. So we want to reduce the rate of fatigue by increasing the rate of ATP resynthesis. Well, this is just generally speaking, for all the systems, well, you want to increase the number of metabolic system enzymes. Any of your ATP, PCR, your media system, your glycolytic enzymes, or your oxidative enzymes. You need to increase those metabolic enzymes, will help up speed the reactions. Of course, like I said, enzymes and substrates go together. So you also need more available substrate. Make sure you have enough glycogen. Make sure creatine phosphate is built up. All that will help speed up, along with enzymes, these reactions. And with enough substrate, usually you limit the amount of metabolic byproducts. Okay? That is, if you're burning enough carbohydrates, you will limit ammonia production. Problem is, you can increase the lactate production as well. But then if you're doing a lot of anaerobic training, that will help out you'll be a lot better because you have more oxidative enzymes, more oxidative pathways. It'll then help clear out the lactate faster. And that CO2, of course, goes to then, the faster you clear that out, it's going to be dependent upon the cardiorespiratory system. So you can see now how all these systems are working together. And so the cardiorespiratory system, remember, this is the delivery and removal system. If you improve your VO2 max, then you'll be able to increase the delivery and the removal of the bad. Biggest thing, stroke volume. It's one of the biggest factors that improves in the cardiorespiratory, one of the biggest factors to our VO2 max and to our oxygen consumption. You also alter blood factors, so number of red blood cells, plasma volume, and then increase the AVO2 difference, which needs help from the metabolic system. But you can see how all these systems are working together to accomplish more or less the same thing. Bringing in the good, taking out the bad. Okay, biochemical changes in skeletal muscle. This is following metabolic system specific training. This specific training, so really, metabolic training, you'll see an increase muscular stores of ATP and creatine phosphate. The only problem is, you see, this is a typical increase seen in untrained following greater than 8 weeks of training. And so you're not going to see as much of an increase in your immediate system just because that system is generally always overloaded. You're thinking an untrained person, going back, we learned they don't really have the oxidative pathway set up. And so you're not going to see a huge improvement in the immediate system or the glycolytic system because those systems are overloaded at all times for the most part. You will see a huge increase in your oxidative system because for those who are untrained, well, that one's not overloaded, so therefore that will be improved. But you can see this one, just with after 8 weeks, you only get about 25% increase in ATP storage. You might see a 200% increase in oxidative storage capacity. We'll see that coming up here in a bit. Not as much in this system just because it's always overloaded. Okay, here the enzymes are associated with the ATP and creatine phosphate because, like I said, substrate and enzymes always go together. So if you're seeing an increase in your substrate within the immediate system, you'll see something with your enzymes as well, but not nearly as much once again. Okay, so here's your myokinase and your creatine phosphokinase. These enzymes go up about the same as what the substrate capacities do as well. So maybe they go hand in hand with one another, but still not as much because they're always overloaded. Okay, you will see an ultramyosin type and cross-bridge numbers. It says typical relative fiber areas of selected athletes. So you see percent slow twitch fiber area. Those who do a lot of distance running will see a huge change in their slow twitch fiber. So get a lot more type 1 fibers as opposed to those who do sprinting and so forth. Okay, so if you want to get type 1 fibers, do a lot of distance work. If you want more type 2 fibers, do way more anaerobic type work to get changes in those fiber types. Now looking at glycolytic system, you only get about a twofold increase in stored glycogen, and that's after you see 20 weeks of training. So even with 20 weeks is what, a third of the year almost, a little over a third of a year thereabouts. And so after at least 4 months of training, you can see you're only getting about a twofold increase in glycogen storage. So that's really not all that much, despite how much training takes place. And that's just because, well, one, you can only store so much glycogen, and two, it's always overloaded because the glycolytic system is always being used, even when we're untrained. And so because it's overloaded, you're not going to see the huge improvements in that system that you would like the oxidative system, where you might see, like I said, a 200% increase in storage capacity. Hexokinase, you'll get a little bit increase, but once again, because we eat so much carbohydrates in this country, that enzyme, because that's the enzyme that when glucose gets into the cell, it attaches a phosphate to the glucose and traps in the cell. So that one's usually overloaded. So you're not going to see as much increase in that. Now PFK, phosphofructokinase, you will see a huge improvement in that. That's just due to, remember, these are untrained. So although they do use the glycolytic system being untrained, PFK is not ramped up to what actually is capable of doing in untrained individuals. So that's why when you start training, you might see a huge improvement in that, because untrained people actually finally start tapping into the potential of this enzyme and what it could do for metabolism. These are just other glycolytic enzymes. So you got alanine and lactate. So they help out with alanine cycle, and then the Cori cycle, which is for lactate. Basically, it's just help converting into new glucose. And so you will see the increase in, these are just, like I said, gluconeogenic enzymes that help out with the alanine cycle, and then lactase for the Cori cycle. So you'll see an improvement in those, but once again, it's not a huge improvement compared to what we'll see with the oxidative system. And then when the oxidative system, so you can see within that self, there's a much greater availability to use the glycogen for fuel. And then you also get a greater increase in muscular stores of triglycerides. Okay, you can see you're able to start storing more triglycerides within the muscle. And so if you really want to get better at the storage capacity here, now the last ones we're looking at was doing more high intensity anaerobic training. So this is looking more at oxidative training, aerobic training, I should say. So you will get a greater increase in glycogen storage when you're doing aerobic training as opposed to anaerobic, just because of how fast it's being used up. But then, like I said, you also get an increase in muscular stores of triglycerides. Okay, and so within this, like I said, you want to get greater storage within these, do aerobic training to help out with the storage capacity of these. You also get increase in myoglobin, increase in pyruvate enzymes, increase in beta oxidation enzymes. You're starting to see a much greater increase in the enzymatic activity here. And also increase in lipolysis. That's why you can see on here improvement range. So increased hormone sensitive lipase. So that's what I was saying. You can see upwards of 200% increase in a lot of these factors. Okay. That improvement range should be actually, I guess I probably could put that at the start of this right here to kind of really signal that point. But, just think of when you do oxidative system through aerobic training, if you're doing that specific there, you can see a 200% increase in a lot of these enzymatic activities. Okay, so that's a huge improvement as opposed to those other systems that we talked about. You also get an increase in mitochondria number, increase in the size of the mitochondria, and an increase in concentration activity of oxidative enzymes. So you can see a huge improvement in all these systems right here from doing aerobic type training. Also get an increase in carnitine enzymes. Remember, carnitine is what carries free fatty acids into the mitochondria. And of course, the increase in hydrogen shuttles. So that's a glycerol phosphate shuttle right there. Now, in terms of cardiovascular adaptations, especially doing endurance training, well, one is you get bradycardia. That is lowered heart rate. That could be attributed to an increased parasympathetic drive, decreased sympathetic drive, or lower intrinsic heart rate. You can see those who undergo a lot of endurance training, you can see male runners have, somewhere around 50 to 60 for the resting heart rate, versus males who are untrained, closer to 80 for the resting heart rate. Okay, so one thing, you get lower resting heart rate from endurance training. Increased stroke volume. That's just a resting stroke volume right there. You can see male runners have, right around 100 or so, a little more than 100 milliliters. And so as opposed to male untrained, it's, a quarter less. I guess it's really hard. You can see the numbers right there, but you can see it's significantly less than the male runners. Okay, female runners always going to have a lower stroke volume just due to females having a smaller heart, smaller blood volume, all the things we talked about in the cardiovascular unit. They increase stroke volume because, one, males have a greater blood volume, and female trainer runners have greater blood volume as well. Males have more than females just due to body size, but you see the difference in the two genders in terms of how much blood volume. The more you train, the greater blood volume you have, which will then increase your stroke volume, which then ideally will then lower your heart rate. Then you got increased heart size. You see in terms of left ventricular size, male runners compared to male untrained. What's interesting, look at the male anaerobic athletes. Okay, so those who do a lot of anaerobic training will get a benefit to the heart. It's not going to be as great as if you're doing purely endurance running, but you still get a stronger, larger heart from anaerobic training. You're also going to get an increased contractility. So thicker walls, more cross ridges, a stronger heart, essentially. Here you'll see anaerobic athletes having the greatest just because of the nature of anaerobic training. But even those who still run, both males and females, all that's going to have a much stronger heart than those who don't train. So other factors that go into the cardiovascular system, well, especially stroke volume, you get increased distensibility, increased venous tone, more rapid filling of the ventricles. Okay, this is all stuff we talked a little bit about in the cardiovascular unit, but now we're just seeing it again. Also get an increase in hemoglobin and an increase in number of capillaries per muscle cell. So what we've seen through all this is basically through training, every system, every aspect that we've talked about is going to get improved. Okay, if you train, you're going to improve those systems. And the more you do, the harder your intensity is of training, the better the adaptations are going to be. So it's just key. Just keep training. All these systems are going to improve, and you'll get the adaptations. Should be a no-brainer, but now you kind of just see some of the data, some numbers that actually really represent through training, everything gets improved upon. So to highlight what we've been talking about, how does training adaptations increase fat utilization, spares glucose? Well, first of all, why is that important? Well, remember, going back to the metabolic unit, when you spare glucose, you preserve it, then you can exercise, you keep competing at a longer time and a faster rate than when glycogen's been depleted. So remember the importance of or glycogen in reference to performance. So that's why we want to spare glucose. And so how can we then increase fat utilization and spare glucose? Well, as we train, we just saw on the last couple slides, we get an increase in capillary density and an increase in mitochondrial number. Okay, that becomes important because one, the capillary density means you have a greater ability to distribute blood to all the working cells. And then that means greater blood to then the second part, well, to the working cells means within each cell you have more mitochondria and greater enzymes. And so as blood's able to get to the tissues, then it's able to, and you see right there, it says slower blood flow to the muscle. So you have a greater density, which means a greater blood flow, which then, or I should say a lot more blood flow, but also it's a slower blood flow as well because you're just not having to work quite as hard because your body can handle the stress. So therefore, you have a lot greater uptake of free fatty acids into the cells. And because you have greater mitochondria, more enzymes, all those abilities there, along with the, like I said, increase in the fatty acid uptake, along with the enzymes and all that, then you're able to use a lot more of the free fatty acids, and doing so will help to spare glucose. Okay, so that's why it's so important to spare glucose, is because it helps you keep going, keep training longer, keep competing. And the way you do that is because you have a greater oxidative system. That is greater blood flow, greater capillary density, greater uptake of free fatty acids, more mitochondria, more of the enzymes, and the greater ability to utilize the free fatty acids. All that's going to help to spare glucose, allow you to keep going at a longer pace and longer time. And also, by using less glucose means less lactate production. Remember back to Unit 2. And how's that accomplished? Well, it says with a greater increase in mitochondria means more fatty acid uptake, fatty acid oxidation, which allows then for a decreased PFK activity. You should remember all that from what we talked about. And so because of the lower PFK activity, decreased pyruvate formation, which then means decreased lactate and hydrogen ion formation, which means pH is maintained. When you have the decreased lactate formation, you're able to maintain pH. And that mitochondria also, because you have a reduced PFK activity, it can uptake the pyruvate NADHs in the mitochondria a lot better to allow for greater ATP formation. All that's going to basically decrease the lactate production, lower the hydrogen ion formation, which means you're maintaining a better homeostasis. pH is being maintained because as you become more acidic, that is a sign of fatigue. So able to maintain the pH will help out with performance. So changes in work induced by training. As you train, it says maximal work, I should say, changes in maximal work induced by training. So you'll get an increase in VO2 max. That's accomplished by increased cardiac output, increased AVO2 difference. The biggest factor in your increased cardiac output is going to be the increase in stroke volume. As it says increased max heart rate with a question mark, remember, you can't increase your max heart rate. That is something that can't be increased based upon just as we get older, max heart rate goes down. However, what training does allows you, it brings you closer and allows you to keep training closer to your max heart rate than I guess being untrained. Okay, so when you're untrained, you really can't get your max heart rate up without fatiguing out. Okay, when you get close to max heart rate, when you're untrained, you basically, at that point, you're stopping. You can't keep going. But through training, what it allows you to do is able to maintain closer to your max heart rate, and you're able to keep working at that max heart rate without fatiguing out. But the biggest factor in your increased cardiac output is going to come from the increased stroke volume from most factors we talked about. Now it says most efficient heart rate, about 187 beats per minute. That's just because we've seen some of the highest VO2 maxes around, people getting close to that, which usually someone who's at 187s in their early 30s. And that's usually where we see aerobic athletes peak out in terms of the best performance age-wise. So that's where we've seen that number come about. And of course, the increased AVO2 difference comes from those factors, which should be noted. That's what we've talked about for the last 3 units now. So including this one, but those are factors that increase AVO2 difference, with the increased cardiac output, thus increased VO2 max. And there's just another flow chart, all the factors we've talked about throughout the last 2 units. So make sure you just be familiar with these and know these, which you should, because it's the second unit now. We've really talked about this. Okay, with maximal work, there will be an increase in lactate production. That's because you have an increased amount of glycolytic enzymes, increased amount of stored muscle glycogen, and also because you're able to train at these higher intensities for longer periods of time. So because of that, you'll be using more glycolysis, therefore you will be producing more lactate overall. Okay, but the good thing with training is you're able to train at these higher intensities, even though you're producing more lactate, but you're able to handle the lactate production via being trained. So that's all maximal work. Now we're going to look at submax, so anything below maximal training. And remember, when it comes to submax, like it says, there's no change in submax VO2 or change in submax cardiac output at any given workload. That's just because no matter what you're doing, there's a certain energy requirement to accomplish that task. So submax VO2 requirements are not going to change based upon what you're doing here or at elevation or train versus untrained. There's an amount of energy required to perform these movements. So, like it says, energetic need to perform a set workload never changes. There's not going to be a change in submax cardiac output or VO2 max at any given workload. However, when you look at the individual variables, you will see a change in those, such as you will have an increased submax stroke volume. That's just because increased heart volume, increased contractility, etc. So even though submax cardiac output is not changing, you will have an increased stroke volume, but also you'll have a decreased heart rate. So that's how they balance out the equation there. And that comes from decreased sympathetic drive or decreased atrial rate. If you're looking at cardiac output and if you're looking at overall VO2, there will be an increase in oxygen extraction. So slower blood flow per mass of active muscle. So more or less, when you're looking at the submax VO2 or cardiac output, those don't change. But when you look at the individual variables, there is a shifting with training. With training comes a greater submax stroke volume, submax AVO2 difference, increase in those ones, and then a decreased heart rate for both cardiac output, which then goes into VO2. Because of all that, decreased lactic acid formation. So you have increased mitochondria, increased fatty acid utilization, increased usage of lactate as fuel, and a decreased use of glycogen and glucose, all of which will decrease lactic acid formation. Getting into overtraining. Better term, I know I've used it, but staleness or burnout, a lot of times are better terms because, well, first, overtraining says an imbalance between high volume, so duration or frequency, and high intensity, and adequate or imbalance between all that and adequate recovery nutrition. It means there's an imbalance between the volume and intensity of training and how much recovery nutrition is taking place. So basically, the body does not let the person does not let the body have adequate time to recover from exercise before training again. So this happens in individuals who have reached their genetic determined maximum. Okay, we use the term overtraining loosely, but really the true term of overtraining, the true definition is really for those who have really reached their genetic potential. That means those who are at the upper echelons of fitness and for training. Pretty much everyone else, we can't overtrain just because we haven't reached our genetic potential. So that's why staleness or burnout is probably a better term, or overreaching. Basically, you're just pushing yourself to a certain point, and you're getting fatigued. Training's not going quite as well, but with a little bit of recovery, a couple days off, some nutrition, some sleep, we come back feeling okay. Overtraining itself, when that happens, it's almost, even with time off and recovery, it takes months and long time to get back to where you once were. And even that, a lot of times, if you've truly overtrained, you may not get back to where you once were. Okay, so, and that's why we say overtraining truly only happens in those who've reached their genetic potential. Everyone else outside the elite athletes, the top athletes, most people are better overreaching or staleness, burnout. Something along those lines is just where you just push yourself to a certain point where you just need some few extra days to recover. And once you get those few extra days, Then at that point, you come back, you get to where you once were. Okay, so, I mean, it's okay to use this term, but just kind of know what it is when we're talking about overtraining, what the true definition, the true relationship to training that really is. And it's not really applicable to be used amongst everybody. Should only be used for those who are at the top of the top within their sport. So these are symptoms. More or less, they can be thought of signpost. Okay, there's no clear cut, like, oh, you've overtrained. But these are kind of like signs. What do signs tell you? They give you a direction to where you're going. Okay, if I'm driving in the Kingsville, it says Kingsville 10 miles, that sign's telling me that, it's directing me that, Kingsville's up ahead. So these are things just to look out for. If you see a decrease in performance, and even with rest time coming back and performance is still decreased, that could be a sign of overtraining. Okay, loss of body weight. We're not talking, loss of water weight during fall football camp. We're talking somebody, and once again, athletes for the most part pretty lean. So if you're seeing drastic, reduction in body weight amongst the already lean population, good chance that overtraining is taking place. If they're getting sick a lot more, that's a good sign. A lot more number of infections. Chronic fatigue, just always, and it kind of goes in psychological staleness, both of those. Just always tired, just down in the dumps, and just kind of, I don't want to say depressed, but I guess maybe depression, because, depression is kind of, it's a lot different than just overtraining. But I'm just saying, if you're seeing those kind of major mood changes in somebody that, especially you've never really seen before, really tired, all that could be signs that they're overtrained. And then you got elevated heart rate and blood lactate levels during exercise. You're seeing something out of whack. Okay, that's all good signs that, hey, somebody might be overtrained. We might need to be careful what they're doing. So it's important. Adequate recovery, nutrition should always be at the forefront of training. It doesn't matter how much they're doing in the weight room. If they're not recovering properly, it's not going to do them any good. Then you got detraining. So this is loss or reduction in body structure and or function is caused by reduction or stoppage of current training program. Okay, you should never stop training at all. Okay, it's a bad idea to train and then just take time off completely. Okay, this is a horrible idea. Even if you just do something once or twice a week, that's enough to maintain basically what's built up. So you never want to be at a point where you're detraining. Okay, and that is basically stopping training for extended periods of time. Even when injured, you should still keep training the non-injured limbs, get something going to keep building up what was, before everything gets torn down. With detraining, you can see it says the greatest loss, so about 50%, is seen in the first week of detraining. This is the metabolic pathways. So with 1 week of no training, you see about a 50% loss in metabolic functions. And it says it takes return to pre-training levels about 4 to 6 weeks. So 1 week off could set you back almost, 2 months before you could get back to where you once were. So that's why it's so important that you never just stop training. That's why, vacation and Christmas breaks and things like that are so hard, detrimental on athletes, because they go home, they eat, they drink, they lay around, they're lazy. Well, if you've been working all fall training up for spring sport, that 1 week off could be detrimental. So that's why it's important that even in times of, rest or, whatever, at least do something. Just a couple of days of some kind of activity to keep maintaining what was built up. It says muscle atrophy varies with fiber type, with slow fibers atrophying sooner than fast. Strength gains are lost slowly. Only completing activity, so like bed rest, casting, space flight, they cause the fastest loss. Luckily, it says most individuals can maintain strength for up to 8 weeks. After 12 weeks, studies report 30% loss. And after 31 weeks, so well over, half a year, strength is still above baseline values. So luckily, with strength, you're not going to lose it quite as fast as like your metabolic functions or like your heart you'll see at the bottom. Okay, so with strength, you can build up, you can take the time off, and usually strength stays elevated for a lot longer periods of time. So that's a benefit. But it's the metabolic factors, and you can see at the bottom of the heart. With 1 week off, you lose 50% of metabolic functions. At the heart, it says 1 week causes a 25% decrease in muscle mass. That's a huge loss just with 1 week off. After 4 weeks, after a month, 50% loss in heart mass. Okay, it's a huge loss with a lot of time off. So that's why it's important that you sorry for going ahead of it there. That's why it's so important that you keep training, you keep just doing something. Even, if you're going on vacation, just do 1 or 2 days of something just to maintain what was built up. It says retraining does not occur as fast as detraining. You can see after 15 weeks of detraining and then 15 weeks of retraining, you can look at the green is max VO2. You can look at then the blue runtime, and then LDH, lactate dehydrogenase, is yellow, and then SDH is succinate dehydrogenase. It's a Krebs cycle enzyme. You can see, max VO2 might get closer to where it once was, but look at the blue line, runtime. Even after 15 weeks of retraining, your runtime is still significantly less than where it once was. Okay, so VO2 is all fine and dandy, but VO2 isn't the only thing going to determine a performance in a race. Is it a safe bet to bet on someone who has highest VO2? Absolutely. But there's a lot of factors that go into performance. You can see right here that the runtime is still way less than it was where it once started. So it doesn't matter if you got your VO2 back up. All those enzymes are down, still lower after 15 weeks of retraining, and your runtime is still lower. So it's still a significantly huge loss just from taking a long period of time off. It says the body does not respond favorably to cycles of training, detraining, and retraining. The body doesn't like anything in the yo-yo effect. We've all heard of the yo-yo diet, where you lose weight, gain it back, lose weight, gain it back, lose weight, gain it back. Okay, the body doesn't like these cycles. It wants more consistency. You can see right here, after 7 weeks or so of training, look how high the VO2 is. And then after 7 weeks of detraining and then retraining, the body just doesn't respond well to this yo-yo effect. Okay. Once again, you might get the VO2 up high, but a lot of these other major performance variables are still way lower than where you started at. And so that's why it's important to try and maintain as much as possible. This is what we're saying with maintenance. It says maintenance at current levels requires training at least at the usual intensity duration at least every 3 days. So all you really need is 2 times per week to maintain. And you can see right here the red lines with max VO2, just with 2 times a week, so every 3 days, you're able to maintain all the adaptations that you built up. And even 1 day a week is still better than 0 days a week. You can see a submax lactate is able to be maintained with just 2 days a week. So that's showing you that your enzymatic activity is able to be maintained with just 2 days a week of training as well. Now, in terms of gender, the influence here, it says men and women can respond similarly to training programs. Okay, in absolute terms, men will always see a more improvement in terms of strength, and you see percent, gaining VO2. So men will see more in absolute terms just because men naturally are stronger than women, can lift more weight. But when you're looking at relative, you can see the same percent improvement. So both men and women can see, for strength, about the same improvement in strength over X amount of weeks of training. Okay, they could both see, you can see right here, over 10 weeks of training, they both saw 25 to 30% improvement in strength. Okay, and then percent of VO2, you see 10 to 14. So that's, pretty close in terms of percent improvement between the two genders. They can see in terms of percent gains relative to their body. Now, if you're looking at absolute terms, that's different because men, by nature, are going to have a higher VO2 than women and be stronger just due to being bigger and stronger, larger muscle, or heart size, blood volume, all that. But what's important is, in terms of percent improvement, the two genders can see the same, and so a lot of times women can see maybe even greater percent improvement just due to they're not as close to their genetic potential as men are. So they're going to see a greater improvement, maybe sometimes percent-wise even than men. But just know between the two, they respond similarly, okay, to basically all types of training. One thing, though, with females need to be careful of is just too much training and improper nutrition in terms of amenorrhea. So you can see the cessation of a menstruation. Okay, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. So amount of training, psychological stress, and low body fat. That's why it's important. Well, we'll go to the next slide. Body fat reason, when you start to see females train too much, they start to lose too much body fat. Well, there's no cholesterol there to be able to make their, you see their gonadal hormones. So there's no cholesterol there to make estrogen. So it might be one of those factors if you have a female that's training tremendous amount. And you see this a lot in female, of course, female endurance athletes. And you might even see this too in female gymnasts. Those are two sports where females have incredibly low amount of body fat. So you really need to make sure that with the training they're doing, that they're getting a lot of nutrition, a lot of fat in their diet, a lot of healthy fat, I should say. Okay, make sure that they're eating enough fat coming in to help out with this hormonal regulation. Men can see it too. It says low body fat leads to low testosterone in males. And men tend to look kind of like a postmenopausal woman. They start to see some of the signs like a postmenopausal woman. And so it's not as common. You don't see as much in males just because males just produce so much testosterone that, you're not seeing as much fluctuations just due to the amount of testosterone that males make compared to females in estrogen. And so with that being said, you're not going to see as much in males as low testosterone. But still, both genders can see a change in this hormones based upon the amount of training they're doing, how stressful the training is, their body fat. So that's why it's so important that if you start to see this going on, especially with your female athletes, all right, we got to change up your diet, make sure you're getting enough fat in the system, because you really don't want to have the hormones being too out of whack. You want to try and have a consistent there because that will impact performance eventually. Okay, so there's some things to look at, especially for females as they're training. One thing, just look at, like I said, nutrition and watching the stress on them and just making sure that you're able to help administer to their needs when need be. So to go over what we just talked about, know that in order to grow, in order to make adaptations, you have to stress the body. That gets into the overload principle, that whatever system's stressed is got stimulus put on it. That's a system that's going to adapt to grow. Okay, and really it comes down to is if you want to get better, you have to put more stress on the body via intensity, duration, or frequency of training. And then make sure specificity of training. Okay, the only system that's going to get overloaded is a specific system that you're training. So if you're an endurance athlete, you need to really stress the cardiovascular system. Okay, if you're an aerobic athlete, anaerobic systems and so forth. Okay, and then of course heredity, which is, individuality, that those who are blessed with the right parents tend to be, the crazy elite athletes. But nonetheless, you still participate, still be good in the sport. It just then comes down to strength and conditioning. It comes down to your programming, how much you're training, and, just those aspects is putting in the work to compete at a certain level. Okay, in terms of the adaptations, basically everything that we talked about this whole entire class, this whole entire course is going to be improved through training. Okay, all the cardiovascular, all the metabolic, all the neuromuscular aspects are going to get improved via training. Okay, and just know then we're talking about maximal versus submax work. Remember, maximal work, stroke volume goes up, AVO2 difference goes up, heart rate, you can't really increase your max heart rate, but then you look at submax variables, submax VO2 and submax cardiac output. There's an energy requirement to complete all movements, but what changes though is those submax variables. So you will get an increase in submax stroke volume, submax AVO2 difference, and then lower heart rate. Okay, and then just make sure you know all those different variables, and then the gender differences we talked about. Basically, just know all those concepts. Make sure you're familiar with all, and then how does training impact every system that we talked about, and those main, through periodization, through proper training. What are we trying to do? We're trying to overload the system. We're trying to be a specific training to really impact that system that's really being utilized in competition, all based around the individual that you're training. Okay, that's why you need to do a needs analysis, understand your athletes, understand the sport, develop a program that's able to be specific to that athlete, to really stress the needs of that athlete, to allow them to be able to perform and compete at a certain level. And that's why it's so important for a professional strength coach and someone who knows what they're talking, doing, someone who's really qualified to be able to address the needs of those athletes, to allow to get the most out of your athletes so they can compete at that high level.